Hello and welcome to the first lecture on the Gilded Age. And so this is the beginning of a new topic, a new unit, and at the beginning of each unit I'm going to try to have one of these main questions to think about and keep in mind throughout the whole chapter. And so the question here to focus on is how did industrialization and urbanization transform life in the United States? Right, so what was life like before these things happened? What was life like after these things happened? And that's what we're going to keep in mind as we go through this chapter, this unit. So I want to start off by just showing you a chart here that represents the change over time of the different levels of industrial output among some of the major industrial powers in the world. And so this starts all the way in 1760, 1750 really, which is when the United Kingdom first starts this, what we call the Industrial Revolution, right? This change in technology and way of doing things. And so it shows you it traces these different countries, empires throughout time, right? And if we notice, we follow the line of the United States, the brown line there, by the 1880s, it starts to increase pretty rapidly, its industrial output. And then by 1900, it's pretty much surpassing Great Britain as the largest industrial nation in the world, right? Producing the most industrial output. And so this change is what we're going to focus on, and it happens really during what we consider the Gilded Age, between 1880 and around 1900. Those 20 years or so, the United States sees a really rapid increase that was happening beforehand, right? All the way back in the 1840s and 50s, it was happening, but it really increases starting in the 1880s. And so just to kind of clarify and highlight two important terms to know for this chapter, the first one is industrialization, right? And so you might be familiar with this term, right? We see the word industry within that word industrialization. And it's the move towards a more industrial society and away from an agrarian one. Agrarian meaning agriculture-based. So we see an increase in manufacturing, an increase in factories, an increase in produced goods, finished goods, and a decrease in the amount of people who are farmers. Right? You see an increase in development of more technology and new sources of power, such as coal, electricity, things like that. And over time, the urban population will surpass the rural population. In the United States, this tipping point happens in 1920, actually, when there's more people living in cities than there are in the countryside. And that last point is related to the next term here, urbanization, right? And this is just the growth of cities. So cities have existed forever, right? But in the United States, right, beginning kind of in the mid-1800s and accelerating throughout the 20th century, throughout the 1900s, you have the growth of cities. People from rural America, farmers, former farmers, and large groups of immigrants, people from Europe, mostly Europe at this point, some parts of Asia, some parts of Latin America, begin immigrating into the United States in large numbers. Groups like the Irish, the Italians, Germans, Jewish, Russians, so on and so forth. Right, but industrialization, this period of industrialization, is really sees a growth in the mining and the production of certain industrial goods that we consider them. Right, so this map here just kind of highlights some of the major industrial cities, and this is again the mid 1800s, 1870s, 1880s. You see cities like you'd expect, New York, Boston, right? You also see Buffalo as a major city at this point. So is Pittsburgh, Chicago, right? St. Louis. These are major industrial centers, right? Where a lot of factories develop, where a lot of production occurs. The purple highlighting here shows you coal, right? And coal is one of the major sources and major powering sources behind the Industrial Revolution in the United States, at least in the first part of it. Also, iron is really important, right? And the orange shades show you where the major iron mining was occurring, right? So the coal and iron mining are kind of, a lot of it's near each other, right? But those are really important sources because those two things, coal and iron, fuel the Industrial Revolution, fuel industrialization. Eventually, later on in the Industrial Revolution, in about the 1870s or so, oil becomes really important as well. And the first successful oil drill is in Titusville, Pennsylvania. But eventually, oil is discovered all throughout the United States. Texas is a major source of oil as well. And oil begins to replace coal as the main source of power behind industrialization. So it goes from coal to oil. And then there's also steel, right? We know steel is really mainly focused around Pittsburgh, on this map anyway, a couple near Chicago. But that's why the football team are the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Because steel was the major industry in Pittsburgh at that time, right? And it's the purifying of iron to make a more durable metal. And so this map just kind of gives you a visual of the industrial materials, the raw materials needed to fuel this industrialization that's happening in the United States. This is zoning in just on one city, the city of Pittsburgh, to give you a kind of even better idea, right? It shows you change over time, this map, right? The white dots are the amount of steel mills that were there in 1886, right? And there's a decent amount of them kind of centered along the river here, right? But by 1906, a couple decades later, you have many more steel mills, right? And Pittsburgh really is a steel industrial town at this point. They rely on steel as to keep the city running. So some important industrial advancements that happened during the period of industrialization. You have the Bessemer process, invented by two different people, one of them being Henry Bessemer in England. And this is the process that I mentioned briefly in the previous slide of removing impurities from iron to produce steel. Right? Steel is much more durable, it doesn't rust as easily, and it's used and it helps fuel a lot of development in the building of things like skyscrapers, for example. So how Manhattan looks today really couldn't be done without the production of steel. A man named Thomas Edison, who might sound familiar to you. He's the first to develop the electric light bulb and really the electric grid that distributes electricity throughout the city. That's one of the reasons why the electrical company in New York City is called Con Edison, Consolidated Edison, right? They're named after Thomas Edison. A couple years later, about 10 years later or so, a man named Lewis Latimer, who's actually an African American, invents carbon filament, which is a better, more effective filament that's used inside light bulbs to actually put the light out, right? And so if you ever look at a light bulb, you can see the filament inside. And Lewis Latimer is someone who invented a new way of doing that. Another major, really important invention during this era are the railroads and the locomotive, right? A locomotive is a coal-powered machine, a coal-powered car that can transport heavy loads with it, and they run along tracks, right? And those locomotives develop into railroads, and railroads are used to transport goods and supplies and also people, right? And it becomes a really important way of transporting people and moving people around the world. Another important invention that happens during this time by a man named Alexander Graham Bell, which might also sound familiar to you, is the telephone, right? The telegraph was a little earlier, but the telephone, people can speak to one another over vast distances through wires, right? Which is an amazing invention that really changes how people communicate throughout the world. Today, people don't really use phones to call or talk to people that much anymore, but this is kind of where it starts, right? And so really within the century between 1825 and say 1925, you have a massive explosion of technological inventions and innovation, right? Things like photography as early as 1826, all the way through the radio and the airplane, right? In the end of the 1900s, end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. So a lot of important things that really change life and really how we experience life today is thanks to a lot of these different things, right? We use the telephone all the time, we use electricity all the time. We watch movies all the time, right? We rely on radio and x-rays for medication, right? Airplanes to travel, right? So really important things are happening that still affect us today. One that I want to focus on in particular is the railroads, because they really are important in the history of the United States. And so this map here is showing you the rates of travel in 1800. This is before railroads were invented, right? So if you're in New York and you want to get to, say, roughly around Pittsburgh, roughly somewhere in central New Jersey, let's say, it takes about a day's travel. If you wanted to get from New York to Chicago, say, it would take about 6 weeks, right? So it's a long time to get to Chicago, right? Those are two major cities in the United States, and it takes a long time to get from one to the other, right? But that changes with the invention of the railroad. So by 1857, so 50, half a century later, the rate of travel increases, right? So if we look at this map again, I want you to take a minute, actually, pause the video, and look at how far can you get from New York in one day? Take a minute, pause the video, and think about that. Right, according to this map, and thanks to railroads, from New York now you can get from New York City not just to parts of New Jersey in a day, but you can get as far as Ohio, right, in one day, through Pennsylvania in one day, down to Virginia in one day, right? So that's a dramatic change. That's a hundreds of miles difference in travel. If you look in Illinois, right, that's about a 2-day travel, right? So it takes only 2 days to get to Illinois or Chicago, where it once took, just 50 years before, it took 6 weeks. If we fast forward even more to 1930, right, things have improved dramatically. And now you can get from New York all the way to Los Angeles, say, or San Diego in just 3 days by the railroads, right? So a major change in transportation. So what once took 6 weeks now takes one day, right, from New York to Chicago. And that's really impressive, right? Because once you start increasing the amount of the speed you can get places, the cost of getting there decreases, right? And so it's cheaper to transport goods and things like that. Right, so the railroads are really important. There's a couple names we should recognize, right? One is George Pullman. He's the owner of a railroad car production company, the Pullman car, that is used by lots of different railroads. He's known kind of for harsh treatment of workers, and when we talk about the labor movement, we'll see his name pop up again. Another famous name is Cornelius Vanderbilt. He originally started with small railroad companies in the Northeast, but he eventually connected them into a regional network. Right, it once took I think to get from New York to Chicago, about 17 different train transfers to get to one state to the other. That's why it took so long. With this consolidation that Vanderbilt and others do, it now takes just one train gets you there, right? And so it reduces travel times and it makes travel more efficient and effective. And it makes Cornelius Vanderbilt one of the richest people in the country. Right? The University of Vanderbilt University is named after the Vanderbilt family. The Transcontinental Railroad is also one of the first major railroad productions that occurs in the United States in 1869, and it connects the East Coast to the West Coast with one rail line. Really important there. During this era of the Gilded Age, right, it's really all about big business and capitalism, right? And so what develops during this time are different forms of companies, right? One of them being monopolies. Monopolies when one company dominates an entire industry. This is beneficial to the company because they get to set the price. There's no competition, right, which allows them to take advantage of consumers, right, the people buying the goods. Some examples of people who are in charge of monopolies and the monopolies that were in charge of are John Rockefeller, right? Rockefeller Center is named after him. That's Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Hall is named after him. J.P. Morgan, right? Morgan Chase is a bank, right? Begins with him. A trust was when competing companies then put all their businesses under the control of one group of trustees, right? And makes it like a corporation. So it's a way of consolidating the competition again, and this benefits all the owners of the companies because now they can all set one price and they can all profit off of that, right? So it's a way of benefiting the big business owners. Right, this chart just kind of highlights some of the different some of the different organizations for businesses that developed during this time, during the Gilded Age. You have corporations, monopolies, trust pools, and a holding company, right? And here's a description of each one of them for you to look at. Monopolies really come in two forms. They're horizontal integration and vertical integration. So these two charts help show what that is. Horizontal is when one company buys up all its competitors, right? So an example here, U.S. Oil, every independent oil company is bought up by one company and they control it all. The other form is vertical integration, right? And so instead of buying up each competitor, what the business does is they buy up each level of production, right? So this is showing a meat industry, right? So a vertical integration is not buying up every slaughterhouse, but instead it's buying the farms where the cattle are grown, the slaughterhouses where they're killed, the railroad cars that keep them refrigerated, the warehouses where they're stored, where they're packed, and then where they're delivered, right? It's all controlled by one person. So that's kind of the difference between these two. And the reason how monopolies are kind of able to exist during this time is because it's really what we consider unbridled capitalism or free markets, right? Or it's also known as laissez-faire economics, right? And this is the belief that the government should not really regulate what happens in the economy and let the natural law of supply and demand take effect, right? And in doing that, it would encourage competition, encourage innovation, and it would benefit both the business owner and the consumers. What we'll see, though, over time is that this free market, if it's not somewhat regulated, it actually benefits the big business owners and harms consumers, right? So there needs to be a better balance, and that's what is kind of learned during the Gilded Age, right? That free markets are good, but they need to be regulated a little bit, right? And so that's what we're going to look at. And the next activity that you guys are going to do is going to focus on that idea of supply and demand and limiting free markets.